The morning Florence Rhodes stood at the grave of the man she had spent 11 years hating was the morning she learned that grief does not always arrive wearing the face you expect. The cemetery sat at the edge of Redemption, Texas, a small town pressed between red clay hills and the wide, unforgiving sprawl of the Llano Estacado, where the wind never truly stopped and the sky at dawn turned the color of a bruise healing over. It was the spring of 1878, and the land was dry again, the way it always seemed to be dry whenever something important happened to Florence. She stood before a plain wooden cross bearing the name Harlan Dodd, and the tears ran down her face in warm, relentless rivers, and she could not understand why. Harlan Dodd had not been a good man. She knew this the way she knew the smell of rain before it came, the way she knew the weight of a rifle, the way she knew the sound of her own name spoken in anger. Harlan had been the man who, 10 years ago, had swindled her late husband, Thomas Rhodes, out of 40 acres of prime grazing land through forged documents and a crooked land office clerk. Thomas had spent the remaining years of his short life fighting to reclaim what was taken, driving himself past exhaustion, past health, past the point where a man's body simply surrenders. He had died 2 winters ago of a fever that Florence had always privately believed was born as much from heartbreak as from any illness. She had buried Thomas, raised their daughter Clara, and kept their remaining farm alive through sheer stubbornness. And she had hated Harlan Dodd with a clean, pure hatred that had been, in many ways, the one simple thing about her complicated life. But now Harlan was dead, thrown from a horse 3 days past, his neck broken on the hard earth he had stolen and grazed and profited from. The 40 acres would pass to no one particular, his estranged family having no legal claim, the whole mess likely to end up in the county courts for years. And Florence had come out here not to celebrate, not to mourn exactly, but for some reason she could not name even to herself, some pull that had brought her 5 miles on horseback at first light. And she stood there and cried. She pressed the back of her wrist to her mouth. The tears would not stop. She cried for Thomas, she understood that much. She cried for the years of fighting and the lost acres, and the nights Thomas had sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, the lantern burning low. She cried for the version of her marriage that might have existed had Harlan Dodd been a different kind of man. She cried because she had spent so long hating someone, and now that someone was gone, and the hatred had nowhere left to live, and it's leaving hurt in a way she had not anticipated. She was so lost inside herself that she did not hear the horse until it was close, and she did not hear the rider dismount until the creak of saddle leather was right behind her. She wheeled around, one hand going instinctively toward the small pistol at her hip, the kind of reflex that any woman living alone on the Texas frontier developed as naturally as breathing. The man who stood before her had his hands up, palms open, the universal language of a person who does not wish to be shot before noon. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, wearing a trail-worn duster the color of old tobacco, a battered hat pulled low against the early sun. His face was sun-darkened, jaw rough with several days of growth, and his eyes were a particular shade of gray that made Florence think, absurdly, of the sky just before a storm that never quite arrived. He was somewhere in his early 30s, she guessed, maybe 32 or 33, with the kind of stillness about him that suggested a man who had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by most of it. He did not say a word. He did not ask her why she was crying at the grave of a man in an empty cemetery at dawn. He did not ask whose grave it was. He did not ask her name or her business or whether she was all right, because it was plain enough she was not all right, and he seemed to understand instinctively that asking would not help. He simply lowered his hands, turned slightly away to give her whatever privacy a person could have standing in an open field, and crouched down near a cluster of scrubby mesquite at the edge of the cemetery fence to wait, as though he had nowhere else to be. Florence stared at his back for a long moment. Her hand fell away from the pistol. She turned back to the grave. She cried a little while longer, the grief running its own course the way it needed to, until finally it slowed and then quieted, the way a hard rain slows to a drizzle and then to nothing. She wiped her face with the corner of her shawl. She straightened her spine the way she always did, that automatic squaring of the shoulders she had learned from her mother and had practiced so many years it had become simply the shape of her. She turned and looked at the man still crouching by the mesquite, apparently studying something on the ground with patient interest. "You can stand up," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "I am finished." He stood and turned to face her, and she saw that he had, in fact, found something interesting on the ground, a flat river rock with a streak of quartz running through it, which he held for a moment, and then set back down with a small deliberate care that struck her as oddly touching. "Florence Rhodes," she said, because if this man was going to be nearby, she preferred to introduce herself rather than be the subject of someone else's speculation. "Joseph Wells," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who had learned that words were more useful when chosen carefully. "I was riding through from Abilene, stopped to water my horse at the creek yonder." He nodded toward the thin line of cottonwoods at the edge of the hill. "Saw you from the ridge." "And rode over," she said. It was not an accusation. "You were alone," he said simply. It seemed like something a person should check on. Florence studied him for a moment. In her experience, men who rode toward a woman crying alone in a remote cemetery were either genuinely decent or hunting for an angle, and she had developed a fairly reliable sense for the difference. This man had not asked a single question. That alone was remarkable enough to put him in a different category. "I appreciate that," she said, and meant it. She walked toward her horse, a steady roan named Biscuit, who was tied to the fence post with the philosophical patience of an animal, long accustomed to her owner's complicated errands. Joseph Wells walked toward his own horse, a big gray gelding that stood slightly apart from Biscuit with the aloof dignity of an animal who considered social interaction optional. Florence mounted. She looked back once at the grave of Harlan Dodd, and felt the strange hollow finality of it settle into her chest like a stone dropping into deep water. "Which way are you riding?" she asked, which surprised her somewhat, because she did not typically ask strangers about their plans. "No particular direction before noon," he said, gathering his reins without any of the self-conscious flourish that younger men tended to put into the gesture. "The town is Redemption," she said, 2 miles east. They have a decent boarding house and a kitchen that serves real coffee, not the roasted grain nonsense they sell at the trading post. The corners of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was clearly the precursor to one. "That is a meaningful distinction," he said. "It is in this county," she said. She rode east. She did not look back again to see if he followed, but she could hear the sound of the gray gelding's hooves on the hard ground, settling into rhythm with Biscuit's steady pace about 3 lengths behind her, and she found that she did not mind. Redemption, Texas was not a town that had ever lived up to its name in any obvious way. It had arrived, as so many Texas towns did in those years, as an accident of geography, a creek crossing and a crossroads, and then gradually a feed store, a saloon, a church that also served as the schoolhouse on weekdays, a blacksmith, a small hotel that called itself the Grand Frontier with the kind of optimism that was either admirable or delusional, and a scattering of homes and ranches spreading outward into the surrounding country. The population on any given day floated somewhere between 200 and 300 souls, depending on whether the cattle drives were in or out, and the general mood of the place swung with equal flexibility between hardworking and restless. Florence kept a farm 4 miles north of town, 30 acres of decent land where she ran a small herd of cattle, a kitchen garden that took most of her summer, and the chickens that Clara adored and Florence merely tolerated. She had one hired hand, an older man named Gus Pemberton who had worked for her since Thomas died, and who was loyal and capable and entirely uninterested in anything beyond the agricultural. She rode into town that morning alongside Joseph Wells, or near him anyway, near enough to exchange a few more words in the easy silence that had settled between them. She learned that he was from Kansas originally, that he had spent the last several years doing cattle work and trail driving, and that he had recently left a long-term arrangement with a spread outside Abilene for reasons he did not specify, and she did not press. At the edge of town, she pointed him toward the boarding house and then turned Biscuit toward the general store, where she had supplies to collect. She expected that would be the end of it, the kind of chance encounter the frontier served up regularly, brief and complete. Clara was at school, Gus was at the farm. Florence went about her morning with the methodical efficiency that had become the rhythm of her survival, collecting flour and salt, and the lamp oil that seemed to disappear faster than anything else she owned, loading the burlap bags into Biscuit's saddlebags, exchanging the necessary pleasantries with Margaret Cole behind the store counter, who was a kind woman and also the town's most dedicated archivist of other people's business. "You were out early this morning," Margaret said, in the conversational tone that was not remotely a question. "Mabel Hutchins saw you riding toward the Hill Cemetery before sunup." Florence kept her expression even. "I had something to attend to." Margaret's eyebrows lifted a fraction of an inch. "Harlan Dodd's funeral was yesterday," she said. "Small affair. His foreman and the preacher and nobody much else. Did you attend?" "No," Florence said. Margaret appeared to wait for elaboration, and when none came she supplied her own meaning with a small knowing nod. "Well, he is gone now. Perhaps things will settle out for the better with that land." "Perhaps," Florence said, and finished her transaction and left. She was securing the saddlebags outside when Joseph Wells came out of the boarding house across the street, apparently having already arranged himself a room, and he stopped on the porch and looked at her with that same steady, unreading expression, and she thought, not for the first time, that it was remarkably restful to be in the company of someone who did not seem to want anything from her. "Mrs. Rhodes," he said from across the street. "Mr. Wells," she said. There was a pause that was comfortable rather than awkward, which was strange given that they had only known each other's names for an hour. "Is there work to be found in this town?" he asked. "The seasonal kind." "I am not looking to stay indefinitely." She thought about it. "The Harmon Brothers Ranch always needs hands in spring," she said, "north side of the valley, and Gideon Price at the feed mill takes on extra men when the drives come through." "I am obliged," he said. She nodded and mounted Biscuit and rode out of town, and it was only when she was halfway home that she realized she was thinking about the color of his eyes, which was not the kind of thing she had been in the habit of thinking about for some years, and the realization sat in her chest in an unfamiliar way, not entirely unwelcome. The week that followed was spring work, the relentless practical business of keeping a farm alive in country that required constant attention. Florence and Gus repaired the north fence line, where the winter had broken 3 posts, drove the small herd to the eastern pasture, where the new grass was coming in, planted the kitchen garden in rows that Florence measured with the same precision she brought to everything, and tended to the daily 1,000 small necessities of a working operation run with lean resources and no margin for waste. Clara was 10 years old and a serious child who looked more like Thomas than Florence, with his dark hair and his watchful eyes, and who had absorbed the losses of her short life with a quiet resilience that both comforted and saddened her mother. She was good at school, quick with numbers, and deeply attached to the 3 chickens she had named, against Florence's firm advice, after the 3 branches of the federal government, which was the kind of thing Clara did. On Thursday of that week, Florence rode into town for the Tuesday post that had come in late, and she encountered Joseph Wells outside the hardware store, talking with Robert Harmon, the elder of the Harmon brothers, who was apparently offering him a trial week's work. She caught Joseph's eye briefly, and he gave her a small nod, and she gave one back, and she collected her post and went home. The letter in the post was from a lawyer in Abilene regarding Thomas's estate, and the possibility that the 40 acres Harlan Dodd had stolen might now be contestable in court, given that Dodd had died intestate and with no clear heir. Florence read it twice at the kitchen table after Clara was in bed, with the lamp burning and the night sounds of the Texas plains coming through the open window, the cicadas and the distant coyotes and the wind in the short grass. She set the letter down and pressed her hands flat on the table. The 40 acres. Thomas had nearly killed himself trying to get them back. Now there was a chance, a real chance, that the law might do what Thomas could not. She should have felt triumph or relief, or at least some kind of uncomplicated satisfaction. Instead, she felt the same hollow echo she had felt at the grave. That sense of arriving somewhere after the journey has already taken its toll, of winning something after the person you were winning it for is gone. She folded the letter and put it in the tin box on the top shelf where she kept important papers, and she went to bed, and she lay in the dark for a long time listening to the wind before she slept. On Saturday, which was the day most of the outlying farms came into redemption for business and socialization, Florence brought Clara into town for her weekly piano lesson with Mrs. Hartwell, who had a proper upright piano in her parlor, and who charged 25 cents per lesson, which Florence considered a reasonable price for the one luxury she allowed her daughter. While Clara practiced her scales, Florence settled into the small reading room at the back of the general store, which Margaret Cole kept supplied with newspapers from San Antonio and occasionally from further east, and which served as the closest thing Redemption had to a public library. She was reading a 2-week-old account of the Lincoln County troubles over in New Mexico Territory, which had been making news throughout the region, and which Florence followed with the grim interest of someone who understood what land disputes turned into when they were left to fester. When the door of the reading room opened, and Joseph Wells came in. He stopped when he saw her, and she saw the brief calculation in his expression, the same honest social arithmetic she did herself, the assessment of whether to stay or to excuse himself. "There is room," she said, and turned a page. He sat in the chair across the small table from her, and picked up the San Antonio Express from the stack Margaret kept on the side table, and read in silence. It was, Florence thought, one of the more genuinely pleasant Saturday mornings she had spent in recent memory, which said something about both the morning and the memory. After perhaps 20 minutes, Clara appeared in the doorway, still slightly flushed from the effort of the lesson, her dark hair escaping from its braid in the way it always did by mid-morning. She looked at Joseph Wells with the direct assessing stare of a child who has not yet learned to pretend not to stare. "Clara," Florence said, "this is Mr. Wells. He is working at the Harmon Ranch." "How do you do?" Clara said, with the grave formality she used with adults. "Quite well, thank you," Joseph said, and looked at her with the same steady attention he seemed to give to everything, not condescending and not performing interest, just genuinely present. "You play piano?" "I am learning," Clara said. "Mrs. Hartwell says I have a good ear but undisciplined hands." "That seems like something practice will fix," Joseph said. Clara appeared to consider this seriously, as if it were a novel perspective. "That is what Mrs. Hartwell says too," she said, "so I suppose it must be right." She looked at her mother. "Can we go to the bakery, Mr. Tomas has the apple turnovers today. I saw them in the window." "One," Florence said, which was the answer she always gave. They left the reading room together, the three of them, which happened naturally and without ceremony, Clara walking ahead with the purposeful stride of a child on a clear mission, Florence and Joseph falling into step alongside each other on the wooden boardwalk outside, and Florence was aware of the way this looked to Margaret Cole, who was absolutely watching from the store window, and she found she did not particularly care. At the bakery, Clara got her apple turnover and consumed it with great methodical pleasure at the small table near the window, while Florence and Joseph had coffee, real coffee, dark and strong, from Mr. Tomas's good pot, and they talked, really talked for the first time. She learned that Joseph had a younger sister back in Kansas, married now with 2 children, who wrote him long letters that he answered badly and infrequently and felt guilty about. She learned that he had started cattle work at 17, after his father died, to help support his mother, and had never quite stopped moving since. She learned that he was 31 years old, and that he had never married, and that he said this last fact without either the embarrassment of a man who felt he should apologize for it or the swagger of a man who felt it made him interesting. She told him about Thomas, more than she expected to. Not the loss of him exactly, but the fact of him, the kind of man he had been, steady and honest and a little too trusting, which was why Harlan Dodd had been able to take what he took. She told him about the farm, about the lawsuit that would probably go on for 2 more years before it resolved, about the way Clara had started sleeping with a candle burning after Thomas died and had only recently stopped needing it. Joseph listened in the same way he seemed to do everything, with his full attention, and without the anxious need to fill silences with his own words. "You have managed a great deal on your own," he said when she had finished. "I have had Gus," she said. "And Clara is not exactly a burden." "I did not mean it as a diminishment," he said. "I meant it as the plain fact it is." She looked at him across the table. The morning light came through the bakery window at an angle that lit the gray in his eyes and made them look less like a pre-storm sky and more like the sky after, when the clouds clear, and the light comes back strong and clean. "I know you did not," she said. Clara finished her turnover and cleaned her fingers with the careful precision she applied to everything, and announced that she wanted to say hello to her friend Nora, who lived 2 houses down. And Florence gave her permission with the usual instructions about being back within the hour. And Clara went, and Florence and Joseph sat with their coffee in the quiet bakery, and the morning stretched out around them like something good. The Harmon Ranch was a solid operation run by Robert and his younger brother Dale, 2 of the more straightforward men in the valley, the kind who hired on talent and paid fairly, and did not make their employees' personal lives into an entertainment. Joseph settled into the work there with the ease of a man who has been doing this his whole life, which he essentially had, and within the first week it was apparent to everyone that he was more capable than average. He had a particular skill with difficult horses, a patience, and a reading of animal behavior that made the breaking and training that would have taken other hands weeks take him days. He came into town most Saturdays, sometimes on a Wednesday evening when the Harmon brothers let the hands off early. On those occasions, when Florence happened to be in town, they talked. Sometimes they walked, which was a thing people did in Redemption on mild evenings, along the main street and down by the creek where the cottonwoods made good shade, with Clara often between them or running ahead, her dark braids bouncing, interrogating the world around her with the endless energy of a curious child. Florence began to notice things about Joseph Wells that were small and specific, and that she found herself cataloging against her will. The way he always tipped his hat to older women. The way he moved around a horse with the same courtesy he extended to people. The way he laughed, which was not often but when it happened was so complete and unguarded that it made the air around him feel lighter. The way he always found the river rock or the interesting pebble, that instinct towards small, beautiful things that she had first noticed at the cemetery. She noticed also that he was careful with her, careful in a way that was not timid but was instead respectful in the old deep sense of the word, meaning that he seemed to genuinely regard her as someone whose choices and comfort and boundaries mattered. He did not push. He did not assume. He arrived where she let him arrive and went no further until she moved the line herself. This was new to Florence, or new enough, and it unsettled her in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. One evening in late May, nearly 6 weeks after they had met, they found themselves alone together for the first time since the morning at the bakery. Clara had gone home with the Hartwell girl for supper, an arrangement the girls had engineered with the practiced diplomacy of children who know when adults need to be manipulated for their own good. Florence had run into Joseph coming out of the livery stable, and they had walked together to the creek, and sat in the good last light of the day on a fallen cottonwood trunk that served most of Redemption as an informal bench. The evening smelled of dry grass and the faint sweetness of the creek, and somewhere distant, someone burning cedar. "I have been writing letters to a land lawyer in San Antonio," Florence said, watching the creek move over the stones. "About the 40 acres. There is a legal mechanism called adverse possession, which under Texas law might apply, given that I have been maintaining the fence line along the eastern boundary since Thomas died. It is complicated, but the lawyer thinks there is a case." "That is good," Joseph said. "It could take years," she said. "Courts in this territory move at their own pace, but you will pursue it." "I will pursue it," she agreed. "I owe Thomas that much, or I owe the truth of it something at least. The land was ours, it should be ours again." "How do you feel about it?" he asked. "Not the legal strategy, the actual feeling of it." She looked at him. The light was going amber and the shadows were long. "That is a surprisingly direct question," she said. "You seem like someone who prefers direct," he said. She thought about it honestly. "Strange," she said finally. "I feel strange about it. I spent years wanting it so badly, wanting Harlan Dodd to face what he had done, wanting the world to simply be fair for once. And now he is dead and the land might come back, and I mostly feel tired and sad in a way I cannot quite name." "Grief does not always run in the direction you expect," he said. She looked at him sharply. "That is almost exactly what I thought," she said. "The morning at the cemetery. That grief does not always arrive wearing the face you expect." Something shifted in his expression, something small and careful and genuine. "I know," he said. "I have stood at graves that confused me too." There was a quiet between them that was different from the comfortable quiet they had developed. This one had weight in it, something being measured. "May I ask?" she said. "My father," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "He was not always a good man to us. But he was the only father I had, and when he died I stood at his grave and could not work out what I was supposed to feel. It took me years to understand that there does not have to be a single clean feeling. That things can be complicated and true at the same time." Florence absorbed this. She looked back at the creek. "Clara asked me once why I cried when Harlan Dodd died," she said. "I told her I was crying for your father, which was true. But there was more than that." "There always is," Joseph said. The last light left the sky and the first stars appeared, which in the Texas plains came in all at once and brilliant, the whole vault of the heavens switching on like something miraculous. They sat in the star-beginning dark, not touching, not needing to, and Florence was aware of a tenderness in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time. "You should probably get back before it is full dark," she said eventually. "So should you," he said. They walked back through town together, and he saw her to where Biscuit was tied, and he helped her up into the saddle with a steadying hand at her elbow that was brief and impersonal, and that she felt for the rest of the ride home in a way that was neither. The summer arrived in the way Texas summers did, without ceremony or apology, going from warm to fierce in the space of about a week, the sky bleaching to a pale glare, and the land drying and the air shimmering with heat above the red clay. Work on the farm intensified with the season, the garden needing constant watering, the cattle needing to be moved to wherever the grass was not yet burned, the whole operation demanding Florence's full attention from before sunup to after sundown most days. She saw Joseph less, not because either of them chose it, but because summer on working land did not leave much margin for choice. When they did see each other, on Saturdays mostly, there was a new quality to the time, a consciousness of its scarceness that made it feel more precious, which she suspected was not entirely accidental. In the second week of June, there was a church social, one of the periodic community events that Redemption organized in the church schoolhouse, tables brought outside under the stars, food contributed from every household, music supplied by Elias Freeman's fiddle and young Danny Price's mouth harp. It was one of those evenings that the frontier threw up regularly, the kind that seemed designed to remind people living hard lives that beauty and pleasure were still available in the world. Florence came with Clara, who was wearing her good dress and who had talked of nothing else for 3 days. Joseph came with Robert Harmon and two of the other hands, which was entirely unremarkable, and yet Florence noticed him arrive from across the yard in the way she had apparently now become incapable of not noticing him. The social went through its stages. Food first, then talk, then the clearing of the tables to make room for dancing when Elias Freeman rosined his bow and tapped his foot 3 times and began to play. Florence danced once with old Mr. Whitfield, who was the oldest man in the county, and who danced with everyone at every social as a point of personal honor. She danced with Clara, which Clara loved with an enthusiasm that was slightly alarming. She stood at the edge of the dancing, talking with Ruth Harmon, Robert's wife, who was good company, and she watched the lantern-lit figures moving in the warm night. Joseph appeared at her shoulder with the same quality he had of arriving without fanfare. "I do not dance particularly well," he said, which was probably a statement of intent rather than a simple fact. "I do not either," she said, which was something of a lie. He held out his hand and she took it. He was not a bad dancer. He was careful and precise, and he moved with the same thoughtful competence that characterized everything he did. She was a better dancer than she had suggested, and she was aware of the particular pleasure of being in step with someone, the way the body finds its rhythm with another body, and the music carries you through what you might not manage in silence. They did not talk while they danced. They did not need to. When the song ended, she was aware that Robert Harmon was watching with the benevolent amusement of a man who has been happily married long enough to find everyone else's romantic progress entertaining, and that Margaret Cole was watching from the refreshment table with what she probably imagined was subtlety, and that Clara was watching from the side with an expression of solemn 6-year-old approval that was, in fact, the expression of a 10-year-old who had simply been waiting for this particular development. Florence stepped back from Joseph's hand and tilted her chin up slightly, which was what she always did when she suspected she might be blushing. "Thank you," she said. "The pleasure was mine," he said, and he said it without any trace of the decorative politeness that would have made it meaningless, so it became simply true. Late in the evening, when Clara had fallen asleep against Florence's shoulder on the edge of the wagon the Hartwell family had parked near the fence, Florence stood a little apart from the remaining festivities under the broad black Texas sky. Joseph came and stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cooling night air. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask me most things," she said. "Do you plan to stay here, in Redemption on the farm?" She thought about it. "Where else would I go?" she said. "That is not the same as wanting to stay," he said. She looked up at the stars for a moment, the vast impersonal scatter of them, the Milky Way like a river overhead. "I want to stay," she said slowly. "The farm is mine. It was ours and now it is mine, and I have worked too hard for it to be somewhere else's. And Clara's roots are here." She paused. "But there are mornings when I drive out to the north fence and stand in the wind and think about how large the world is and how long the days can be." She felt rather than saw him nod. "I am not sure I have ever known how long I plan to be anywhere," he said. "I have always moved when the work moved." "Does that suit you?" she asked. A long silence. The fiddle had stopped and someone was singing somewhere on the other side of the tables, a low, sweet song she could not quite hear. "Less than it used to," he said. She did not look at him. She did not need to, and she understood that he did not need her to. July brought the first real cattle drive through the valley, a big herd coming up from the south heading for the railhead at Abilene, and the whole character of Redemption changed for the 2 weeks it took for the drive to pass through the area. The town filled with trail hands, and the saloon ran long and loud, and the streets were dusty with traffic and business, and everyone from the feed store to the bakery to the boarding house ran at full capacity. The Harmon brothers sent several of their hands to help with the drive for the final stretch, which paid well and was good for relations with the big operators. Joseph was among those who went, which Florence knew because Robert Harmon mentioned it in passing when she stopped at the ranch to check on a fence dispute with the eastern boundary, and which she received with the carefully neutral expression she had been using to discuss Joseph Wells with other people for approximately 6 weeks. He was gone 8 days. They were perfectly ordinary days on the farm, the same work in the same heat, Clara's lessons and Gus's steady, reliable presence, and the chickens and the garden and the cattle. And yet there was a quality to those 8 days that Florence did not like to examine too closely. He came back on a Thursday afternoon, and she happened to be in town when he rode in with the Harmon hands, and he saw her from across the street and raised one hand in greeting, and she raised hers back, and that was all. But she was smiling when she turned away, and she let herself smile and did not question it. The following Saturday he came to the farm. She had not specifically invited him, and he had not specifically announced he was coming, but it happened anyway, in the way that some things happen which are preceded by so much unspoken intention that, by the time they actually occur, they feel less like a beginning than a recognition. He rode up the track to the house mid-morning with a small bunch of wildflowers wrapped in a piece of brown paper, which he handed her without ceremony or elaborate explanation. "I passed a whole field of them coming up the North Road," he said. "It seemed wasteful not to." She took the flowers. They were bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush, and a little yellow flower she did not know the name of, still bright and fresh. "Come in," she said. "I will put these in water, and there is coffee." He met Gus, who assessed him with the particular efficiency of an older man who had seen a lot of people come and go and knew quickly which kind this was, and who apparently satisfied himself within about 30 seconds, because he went back to the fence post he had been resetting with the quiet of someone removing himself from a conversation he understood was not his. Clara came out of the house when she heard the horse and stopped on the porch step and looked at Joseph with the same solemn assessment she had given him in the reading room, and then her face broke into the smile she reserved for things she approved of. "Mr. Wells," she said, "have you come to fix our north pasture fence? Because Mama says it needs a new post near the gate." "Clara," Florence said from the kitchen window. "I could look at it," Joseph said to Clara, with the perfect gravity of someone taking a 10-year-old's practical concerns seriously. They spent the morning in that way, which was perhaps the best possible way Florence could have imagined spending a morning, the kind she had stopped letting herself imagine somewhere in the last 2 winters. Joseph and Gus replaced the fence post near the north gate, while Florence and Clara made lunch. Clara showed Joseph her 3 chickens with intense biographical detail, while Florence pretended to be busy weeding the garden, and was actually listening to every word. They ate lunch at the table outside under the shade of the old live oak, a proper meal, beans and cornbread, and the last of the preserved peaches from the previous fall. And the conversation ran easy and comfortable and full of the small, pleasant nonsense that happens when people feel at home with each other. After lunch, Gus went back to his work and Clara was dispatched to her reading, and Florence and Joseph sat at the outside table with the remains of the coffee and the afternoon sounds of the farm around them, a chicken somewhere making its announcements, the wind in the oak, the distant low of the cattle. "I should tell you something," Florence said. He looked at her without shifting his expression. "I have not been particularly available," she said carefully, turning her coffee cup in her hands. "Since Thomas died, I have been here, I have been functional, I have been a great many practical things. But I have been very careful about keeping the parts of myself that are not practical very much to myself. I have noticed," he said. "I have not minded." "I know," she said. "That is part of what I am trying to tell you." She looked up at him. "You have been the most patient man I have encountered in 11 years of marriage and 2 years of widowhood, and I am aware that there is something particular between us, and I am tired of being careful about noticing it." Something shifted in his face, a careful held-back thing releasing. "Florence," he said. "I am not done," she said. "All right," he said. "I am a widow with a 10-year-old daughter and a farm with uncertain legal claims, and enough practical concerns to fill any reasonable man's lifetime, she said. I am not easy. I am not simple. I have strong opinions about most things, and I am not very good at pretending I do not. And I spent 11 years with a man who was patient and kind but who left too soon, and the experience of being left has not made me cautious in a healthy way. It has made me cautious in the way of someone who is afraid. She took a breath. I am not afraid of you. That is unusual, and I want you to know that I recognize it. Joseph was quiet for a moment that felt very long, looking at her with that steady gray-eyed attention. Then he reached across the table and laid his hand over hers, just that, no gripping, just the warmth of his hand over hers, the steady pressure of it. I came to this county with no particular direction, he said. I have been moving since I was 17 years old, and I stopped knowing why some time ago. And then I rode over a ridge and saw a woman standing at a grave in the early morning, crying in a way that was the most honest thing I had witnessed in years. I could not ride past that. You never asked why, she said. I did not need to, he said. It was not my question to ask. It was enough that you needed to be there. She turned her hand over under his and held it, which was a simple thing and felt enormous. I am not in any hurry, he said. I am not going anywhere. She believed him. She had believed few things as cleanly and completely as she believed that. Sitting in the dappled shade of the live oak with the Texas summer stretching out in every direction, and her daughter reading inside and the farm quiet and the 40 acres somewhere to the east, still waiting for justice, and this man's hand in hers. Good, she said. And she looked at him and allowed herself to smile fully, without qualification, which was a thing she had not done in longer than she could measure. The summer deepened and the law moved at its own pace, which was glacial, and the farm demanded its constant attention, and Joseph Wells rode out from the Harmon Ranch every Saturday and most Sundays and sometimes on Wednesday evenings. And he did not ask to stay, and Florence did not ask him to, because the shape of things was building itself at its own honest rate, and she trusted that more than she would have trusted any rushing. They rode out together sometimes, just the two of them when Clara was at school and Gus was managing, covering the boundary lines of the farm the way farmers always have, partly from practical necessity, and partly because there is something about moving through land you love with someone you are falling in love with that is its own kind of prayer. Florence showed him the place on the eastern boundary where the stolen 40 acres began, the fence line Harlan Dodd had moved on the forged survey, the rich grass land beyond it that should have been theirs. Joseph stood at the fence and looked at it for a while. It is good land, he said. It is, she said. Thomas always said the eastern 40 was the best of what we had. The soil runs deeper there and the creek feeding it is more reliable. You will get it back, he said. The lawyer writes that the case is strong, she said. The forged survey has been identified as fraudulent by 2 independent surveyors. It is a matter of time and process. Then it is coming, he said, with the simple certainty of someone who knows that the right outcome, when it is genuinely right and the machinery is working properly, eventually arrives. She looked at him against the bright sky, his hat brim casting his eyes in shadow, his easy posture on the bay horse he had borrowed from the Harmon stock. She thought that she had not fully understood, in the years of Thomas's illness and death and the grinding labor of survival, that she had not merely lost a husband, but had also lost the particular kind of company that is another person who sees the same things you see and values them for the same reasons. She had been alone in her seeing for 2 years. The discovery that she was not alone in it anymore was the kind of thing that made the whole landscape look different. Joseph, she said. He looked at her. I would like you to kiss me, she said. He considered this with the same deliberate care that he brought to most decisions, which lasted approximately 2 seconds, and then he turned his horse alongside hers and leaned across the space between them and kissed her, properly and without hesitation, one hand coming up to touch the side of her face with a gentleness that was also somehow not gentle at all. that contained within it something urgent and deep and long withheld. When they separated, the wind moved through the grass on both sides of the fence line, and a red-tailed hawk turned overhead in lazy circles, and Florence pressed her cheek briefly to his shoulder before straightening and looking ahead across the land. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed, and she could hear in his voice the thing she knew was in her own, that note of arrival that comes after a long journey. They rode back to the farm in the late afternoon sun, and neither of them needed to name what had changed, because they both knew, and knowing was enough. August was the month of full heat and full heart. The farm was running well, the cattle fat on the grass that had recovered from the early summer dry, the garden producing enough that Florence put up jars of tomatoes and peppers that lined the cellar shelves in satisfying rows. Gus noticed the change in the household with the perceptive pragmatism of a man who pays attention and who was genuinely glad for his employer, expressing this in his way by working harder and asking for no acknowledgement of any of it. Clara noticed the change the way children notice everything, which is completely and without pretense. She had taken to Joseph with the wholehearted clarity of a child who has been without a father for 2 years, and who recognizes without sentimentality or desperation, but simply with glad certainty that here is someone worth knowing. She taught him the names of the chickens and the branches of government they represented, a conversation that took 30 minutes and which Joseph engaged with entirely seriously. And she showed him her reading books and her arithmetic exercises and her drawings of horses, which were impressive. One afternoon in mid-August, when Joseph had stayed for supper and afterward sat on the porch while Florence washed dishes, Clara came out with her drawing paper and sat beside him on the step and drew his portrait in the precise, careful way she drew everything, the tip of her tongue between her teeth. When she finished, she held it up. It was a good likeness, unmistakably him, the hat and the jaw and the particular set of his shoulders. "That is very good," Joseph said, and he meant it. "I drew one of Mama too," Clara said, "but she makes a face when I try to show her." Florence, who could hear this perfectly through the open window, did not comment. "I could put them together," Clara said. "In one picture." There was a pause. "I think your mother should get a say in that," Joseph said. Clara considered this with the expression of someone accepting a reasonable amendment. "Mama," she called, "may I put you and Mr. Wells in the same picture?" Florence came to the door, drying her hands on the dishcloth, and looked at her daughter and then at Joseph, who was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man exercising significant restraint. "Yes," Florence said, "you may." Clara beamed with the satisfaction of someone whose instincts have been validated and bent back over her paper. Joseph looked up at Florence then, and she looked back at him, and the evening light was gold and low, and somewhere out in the pasture, the cattle moved through the grass with the sound of bells, and she thought that if she could choose a single moment to hold on to press between the pages of her life and keep, it might be this one. Fall came to the Llano Estacado the way it always did, not gradually but all at once, the heat breaking in a single day and the sky going a deep brilliant blue that was different from the summer sky in quality and depth, crisper and more serious. The mornings turned cold and sharp and smelled of dried grass and the first wood smoke from the town's chimneys. The letter from the San Antonio lawyer arrived in the second week of September, and Florence read it 3 times standing at the mailbox at the end of the track before she walked slowly back to the house and sat down at the kitchen table. The court had ruled. The fraudulent survey had been formally invalidated. The 40 acres, the good eastern land with the deep soil and the reliable creek, was legally restored to the estate of Thomas Rhodes, which meant it was now legally hers. She put the letter down and pressed her face into her hands and breathed. She had won. Thomas had won, through her, through years of work and stubbornness and the slow machinery of a law that had eventually done the right thing. The land was coming home. She sat that way for a long time, and then she heard the sound of a horse on the track, and she looked up, and it was Joseph, which was not surprising because it was a Saturday, and he always came on Saturdays, and she stood up from the table and went to the door. He saw her face from the yard and dismounted quickly and came toward her. "What is it?" he said. She held out the letter. He read it. She watched his face as he read it, the careful attention he gave it, and then the look when he reached the conclusion, something warm and definite crossing his features. "Thomas's land," she said. "Your land," he said. She nodded. And then, for the second time in a season, she cried. And again it was not the crying she expected, but something else, something that came from the deepest place of exhaustion and effort and relief, the particular crying of someone who has carried something heavy for a very long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. Joseph did not hesitate. He closed the distance between them and put his arms around her, and she put her face against his chest and let it come, all of it. The grief for Thomas and the years of fighting and the relief and the strange, sweet sorrow of winning something after the person who needed it is gone. He held her without saying anything because he had always understood that words were often the wrong thing, and after a while she straightened and pressed the heels of her hands to her face and breathed. "He would have been glad," she said. "He would have," Joseph said. She looked up at him. His arms were still around her and she did not move away from them. They were standing in the doorway of her farmhouse with the fall sky enormous and blue overhead, and the 40 acres somewhere on the eastern edge of the property being returned to her in the slow, steady way that justice sometimes arrives. "Joseph," she said. "Yes," he said, as though he knew what was coming and wanted to reach it with her. "I love you," she said. It came out entirely clean, without the qualifications she might have surrounded it with a month ago. "I did not plan to say it today, but there it is." His arms tightened around her. "I love you," he said, into the top of her hair. "I have been in love with you since approximately the morning at the creek when you told me that real coffee is a meaningful distinction, which is possibly the most practical thing anyone has ever made me fall in love over." She laughed, which she had not expected to do in the middle of crying, and the laugh was genuine and surprised, and it broke something open in her chest in the best possible way. "That is a terrible reason," she said. "It was entirely convincing in the moment," he said. She pulled back to look at him, this man who had ridden over a ridge and seen her crying and had not asked a single question and had simply stayed. "What do you want?" she asked. "Actually want. Not what is practical or logical or what makes sense. What do you want?" He held her gaze with the directness that was so characteristic of him. "I want to stay," he said. "Here, I want to work this land with you. I want to see Clara grow up. I want to be the person who is here when you need someone to be here." He paused. "I want to ask you to marry me, but I suspect you are going to make me ask that in a more organized fashion." "You should probably ask Gus's opinion first," she said. "He will be insufferable if he is not consulted." "Is that a yes pending Gus's opinion?" She looked at him for a long time. The wind moved through the live oak. A chicken somewhere expressed an opinion that no one had asked for. The land lay around them in the fall sun. 30 acres of good Texas farm and now 40 more of the best grazing land in the county, all of it waiting, patient and generous, the way good land always is. "That is a yes," she said, "pending nothing." He kissed her then, in the full daylight and the open air and the complete uncomplicated happiness of the moment, with no audience except the very opinionated chickens, and it was better than the first time, which had already been excellent. They were married in December, on a clear, cold Saturday in the church schoolhouse, with the school desks pushed to the sides, and the whole congregation of Redemption present because Margaret Cole had made sure every single person in the county was personally informed. Florence wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that Clara had convinced her to have a bit of ribbon added to, and her dark hair pinned with the small pearl combs that had been her mother's. Joseph wore his good suit and his cleanest hat, and had made the effort of a proper shave, which Clara had inspected and approved earlier that morning with the gravity of an official inspector. Clara served as the formal witness, standing beside her mother with the solemn pride of a child participating in something she had recognized was right long before either of the adults involved had properly admitted it. She had drawn their portrait again, the one she had started on the porch that evening in August, and had given it to Florence that morning, the three of them this time, herself between the two adults, all recognizable and all unmistakably together. Florence kept it. She would keep it her entire life. The ceremony was conducted by Reverend Marsh, who was a decent man and a serviceable preacher, and who had married enough frontier couples to understand that the people standing in front of him had been through things the vows could not fully contain, but tried to gesture toward. He read the words and they said them back, Florence and Joseph, in the middle of their community in the winter of 1878, and when Joseph said, "I do," he looked at her in a way that made the whole church slightly blurry, or that was what Florence told herself afterward when Clara asked why she had cried at her own wedding. "Happy crying is different from sad crying," Clara said knowledgeably. "Entirely different," Florence agreed. The reception was a general celebration in the way that frontier town celebrations were, with food from half the town's kitchens and Elias Freeman's fiddle and dancing. And Florence danced with Joseph for a long time in the warm, crowded room with the cold stars outside and the fiddle singing. And it did not matter at all that neither of them was the most elegant dancer in the room, because they were exactly in step with each other, and that was everything. Gus, who had given his opinion of Joseph with the verdict of an old hand who knows good stock, had been best man in the way he handled everything, with efficiency and without ceremony. He had shaken Joseph's hand after the vows with a grip that expressed both welcome and expectations, which Joseph had received with equanimity. Joseph's sister, a woman named Alina, had written a letter full of genuine warmth when informed of the engagement, expressing among other things a profound relief that her brother had finally stopped moving, which she had been waiting for. She wrote, for the better part of 15 years, and a wish that the distance from Kansas was not so great, because she very much wanted to meet Florence and Clara in person, and she would be there in spirit if not in body, which Florence found enormously touching. The farm changed shape in the months that followed in the way that a life changes shape when another person becomes genuinely part of it, not just additive but transformative, the whole thing rearranging itself around the new fact. Joseph brought skills and knowledge that complemented Florence's in ways that seemed almost planned, his expertise with horses and cattle management fitting cleanly alongside her instinct for land and crops and the practical running of a household. They worked together with the easy efficiency of people whose rhythms have synchronized, who have learned each other's methods and vocabulary without needing to formalize either. The 40 acres were fenced in proper in the spring of 1879, good post and wire fencing that Joseph and Gus set over 3 weeks in the cold early months, and when they were done Florence walked the perimeter of the land alone in the early morning, the way she had once walked to Harlan Dodd's grave, and she stood at the eastern edge where the creek ran clear, and the grass was already coming in thick and green, and she spoke to Thomas, just briefly. In the way one speaks to the people one has loved and lost, not expecting an answer but needing to say the words. "We got it back," she said, "the way you always said we would." The wind moved through the fresh grass and the creek ran over the stones, and the morning was cold and clear and entirely at peace. She rode home to her husband and her daughter and her farm. By the summer of 1879, the east pasture was running 20 head on the new grass, and the farm's income had increased enough that Florence could hire a second hand for the busy season, and could think about making improvements to the house that Thomas had always wanted to make, but had never had the resources for. A proper back porch, a new window in the kitchen that faced east, flooring in the upstairs room that had always been bare boards. Joseph built the porch himself over 3 weekends in July, and Florence and Clara sat on it in the evenings watching the sun go down over the Llano Estacado in the way sunsets happened there, in extravagant color, the whole western sky going orange and pink, and then a deep burning red before the dark. Joseph wrote to Alina, and they corresponded with more regularity than he had managed in the previous decade, which Alina noted in her letters with affectionate exasperation, and plans were made for her to visit with her husband and their 2 children in the following spring, a prospect that gave Clara a level of excitement that manifested in months of preparatory planning. Clara was doing brilliantly in school. Mrs. Hartwell had started teaching her more complex pieces on the piano, and was of the firm opinion that the child had genuine talent that deserved proper nurturing, and there were conversations about the possibility of sending her to San Antonio for more formal instruction when she was older, which was still years away, but worth beginning to think about, and which Florence and Joseph discussed with the care and seriousness they brought to anything involving Clara's future. One evening in late fall, as the anniversary of their meeting approached, Florence sat on the new back porch with Joseph in the cold, clear night air, both of them wrapped in the heavy blankets that frontier winters required. Clara was inside asleep, the candle no longer needed at all. "What do you think about?" Joseph asked. It was not a frequent question from him, which made it more worth answering. Florence looked up at the stars. The Milky Way was there, brilliant and indifferent and beautiful, the same as it always was. "About how different it is," she said, "to be here now compared to a year ago." "Different how?" "Bigger," she said. "The world feels bigger, stranger, more possible." She paused. "I spent a long time making it as small and manageable as I could because small and manageable was how I survived. And now it is big again and I am not afraid of it. That is different." He was quiet for a moment. "I know what you mean," he said. "I made my world very narrow on purpose. Just the next job, the next trail, the next county. I did not look at the horizon for years because looking at the horizon makes you want things." "And now?" she asked. "Now I look at it every morning," he said, "and everything I want is already here." She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the cold and the starlight, and the land lay around them in every direction, theirs and good. Florence discovered she was expecting a child in the December of 1879, almost exactly a year after the wedding. She told Joseph on a quiet evening after supper, after Clara had gone to bed, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, and she watched his face move through a sequence of expressions that was one of the finest things she had ever seen. First, the stillness of not quite believing. Then, the understanding. Then something that was not joy exactly, not yet, but was the gate that joy would come through, a kind of fundamental yes, visible in every line of him. "Florence," he said, and her name in his mouth in that moment was a complete sentence. She reached across and took his hand. "Next summer," she said. "The doctor in town thinks July." He covered her hand with both of his and held it, and they sat in the lamplight in the warmth of the kitchen, while the winter went on outside, and the future arranged itself around them in the best possible way. She told Clara the next morning, sitting on the edge of Clara's bed, while the winter morning light came gray and thin through the window. Clara listened with the serious attention she brought to important information, and then sat quietly for a moment that Florence spent holding her breath. "Will it be a boy or a girl?" Clara asked. "We will not know until it arrives," Florence said. Clara thought about this. "I think a boy would be interesting," she said. "I have never had a brother." "A brother would require a great deal of patience on your part," Florence said. "I have patience," Clara said. "I am very patient with legislative, and she is the most difficult chicken." She paused. "Will you still be my mother the same as always?" Florence felt the tightening in her chest that her daughter always managed to produce with the plain-spoken precision of her questions. "Absolutely and entirely the same as always," she said, "and a little more, if anything." Clara nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose important question has been answered properly. "Then I think it is good news," she said. "So do I," Florence said, and hugged her daughter, who hugged back with the full-arm urgency of a child who has learned that the people you love are worth holding on to. Spring came again, the second spring of their marriage, and Alina arrived from Kansas with her husband James and their children, 2 boys of 7 and 9, who were immediately and completely absorbed into Clara's orbit like small planets finding a sun. Alina was a warm, frank woman who looked nothing like Joseph except around the eyes, with the same gray steadiness in them, and she and Florence took to each other with the directness of people who have both spent time doing difficult things and have no patience left for pretense. "I should tell you," Alina said on the second evening of her visit, sitting with Florence on the porch while the men and children were somewhere in the yard conducting an investigation of the natural world, "that my brother is happy in a way I have not seen since we were children, before our father's troubles. I want you to know I noticed that." Florence was quiet for a moment. "He has made me happy in a way I did not know was still available to me," she said. Alina smiled, and it was a full and genuine thing. "Good," she said. "Good. That is exactly how it should be." The evenings that week were some of the most abundant Florence could remember. The house full in the way it had not been full, noisy with children and conversation, and the sounds of people who genuinely liked each other. The kitchen always producing something, and the table always holding more people than it was strictly sized for, which no one minded at all. Joseph at the center of it all, a little quieter than the others as he always was, but present in every sense, watching his sister's children race across the yard with the children of Clara, watching his wife in the kitchen doorway, watching the farm with the eyes of a man who has finally put down roots and can feel them taking hold. On the last evening of Alina's visit, Florence found Joseph standing at the east fence line, looking out over the new pasture as the sun went down. She came and stood beside him. "She approves," Florence said. "I know," he said. "She told me directly. Alina is not subtle. I like that about her." "So do I." He was quiet for a moment. "I have not been in the same place as my sister for more than 2 days running in 8 years," he said. "Funny. I did not realize how much I missed that until I had it again." "You could have it more often," Florence said. "Kansas is not the end of the world. They will come again," he said, "and we will go there maybe in a year or 2. When the baby is old enough to travel." She thought. The word still struck her sometimes with its quiet completeness. We and ours, the plain small words of a shared life. "Yes," she said, "we will go." July brought the summer fierce and bright, and the baby arrived on a Thursday morning when the heat was already tremendous by 9 o'clock, and the doctor made his way out from town in the first light, and Florence worked harder than she had worked at anything in her life, which was saying something considerable, and Joseph sat outside the bedroom door for 3 hours in a state of focused and silent endurance that Gus later described as the most terrifying thing he had witnessed in 40 years of frontier life. The baby was a boy. He was born just after 10 in the morning, robust and loud and deeply offended by the existence of the world, with a head full of dark hair, and when the doctor finally convinced him to open his eyes, a pair of gray irises that made Florence look at Joseph and start crying, which she blamed on the exhaustion. "Thomas," Joseph said, not as a question, when she told him the name she had been holding for months. "Thomas Joseph," she said, "if that is all right." He looked at his son for a long moment, the small, furious person in the crook of Florence's arm, and when he looked up his eyes were wet, which was the only time Florence had ever seen that. "That is very much all right," he said. Clara met Thomas Joseph that afternoon coming in from school to find the household transformed, and she stood beside the bed and looked at her brother with the same solemn, assessing gravity she brought to everything. And then she looked up at Florence and Joseph with an expression that was enormous with the significance of the moment. "He is very small," she said. "He will grow," Joseph said. "I know," Clara said. "I am not worried. I just mean right now he is small." She reached out one careful finger, and the baby wrapped his hand around it with the blind, instinctive grip of newborns. And Clara's expression changed to something Florence wanted to paint and hang in every room of the house. "Oh," Clara said softly. "Hello." That night, after the doctor had gone and Gus had gone home to his quarters, and Clara was asleep and Thomas Joseph was in the cradle Joseph had built in February from the good cedar he had been curing since December, Florence lay in the lamplight with Joseph's hand in hers, and the baby asleep not 2 feet away and the farm quiet around them. "I keep thinking about the morning I went to the cemetery," she said. He turned to look at her. "I could not have told you why I needed to go," she said. "I just knew I did. And I was standing there crying over a man I hated which I could not explain, and I heard you ride up, and I thought, this is someone who is going to ask me a great many questions I am not prepared to answer." He smiled, the full unguarded smile that still had the power to make the air in the room feel lighter. "And then you did not ask anything," she said. "It was not my place to ask," he said. "I know," she said. And somehow that was exactly right. That someone could see me in a complicated moment and simply stay. She squeezed his hand. I had been managing everything alone for so long that I had forgotten what it was like to have someone simply be there. "I am here," he said. "I know," she said. The baby made a small sound in the cradle, the settling sounds of a sleeping infant, and they both looked at him for a moment and then at each other. "We are going to be all right, you know," Florence said. "I know," Joseph said. "We have been all right for a while now." "I am still glad to say it out loud." "So am I," he said. The years that followed were the kind that fill a life properly, not with spectacle but with the deep accumulating weight of ordinary days that are not ordinary at all, but are the actual substance of everything. Clara grew into a young woman of formidable intelligence and composure, and at 15 went to San Antonio for a year of formal piano study, writing letters home that were full of the world she was discovering. Thomas Joseph grew from a furious infant into a determined and curious boy who had Joseph's stillness and Florence's stubbornness, and who was the particular delight and occasional exasperation of everyone who knew him. The farm prospered, not extravagantly but solidly, the way good land and careful management produce, year over year, the patient accumulation of a life built right. Joseph eventually bought a modest additional parcel to the north, expanding the cattle operation to a size that gave them real security, and he brought a young horse-training operation to the ranch that earned a regional reputation for the quality of the animals it produced. Florence won the land case she had begun, fully and finally, in the spring of 1880, the last legal challenge to the restored 40 acres dismissed by the circuit court, with a finality that made the San Antonio lawyer write a letter of genuine congratulation. She rode to the eastern pasture the day the final document came and stood at the fence line again, and this time there were no tears, only the clean satisfaction of a thing completed, a debt honored. The grave of Harlan Dodd weathered and faded over the years, as unmarked graves do, the wooden cross softening in the rain and sun. Florence rode past it sometimes on her way to the eastern boundary, and she never stopped, but she always slowed Biscuit slightly, a gesture she could not have fully explained but which felt right, an acknowledgement of the complicated tangle of human lives and human wrongs, and the fact that, in the end, the land outlasted all of it. On the evening of their 5th anniversary, Florence and Joseph sat on the back porch they had built together in that first summer, the same stars overhead that had always been there, the same wide Texas sky. Thomas Joseph was asleep inside. Clara was in San Antonio this particular week, her letters full of music. Gus had retired the previous spring, his joints finally overruling his stubbornness, and his replacement, a capable young man named Henry, had the bunkhouse now and was working out well. "I was thinking today," Florence said, "about the morning I met you." "What were you thinking about it?" "That I would not have planned it," she said. "If you had asked me at any point in the previous 2 years to imagine how I would meet the person I was going to love, I would not have imagined that. Standing at the grave of the man I hated, crying without quite knowing why, with you riding over a ridge for no particular reason." "I had a particular reason," Joseph said. "What was that?" "I saw someone alone," he said. "That is always a reason." She looked at him. The evening light caught the silver that had begun to come in at his temples, which she found entirely unreasonably attractive, and the ease in him that had always been there, the complete comfortable rightness of him in this place, in this life. "That first morning," she said, "when I was crying and you did not ask a single question, that was the thing, I think. That was what changed." "Changed what?" "What I thought was possible," she said. "I had decided without really deciding that I was done with the kind of possibility you represented, the kind of being seen by someone who does not need you to explain yourself." She shook her head slightly. "And then there you were, not asking." "I had no questions," he said. "I understood what I was seeing." "What were you seeing?" He considered this for a moment, with the characteristic care that she had grown to love so deeply it had become the architecture of their life together. "A woman who was true," he said finally. Whatever she was feeling it honestly. There was no pretending. I had not seen that in a long time, and it was like water when you are thirsty. Florence sat with that for a moment. The night insects had started in the grass, the cicadas and the crickets that were the sound of Texas evenings in every season, and somewhere in the far pasture one of the cattle made a low sound. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said back. In the simple, direct way he said everything, without decoration or embellishment, just the plain, absolute truth of it. They sat together on the porch of their farm under the Texas stars, the land theirs and good and restored and full of the future, and the house behind them warm with their children sleeping, and the life they had built together sprawled out in every direction like a country with no end. And Florence Rhodes, who had once stood at the grave of her enemy and wept for reasons she could not name, knew with every fiber of her being that grief had, in fact, arrived wearing a face she had not expected. It had arrived wearing the face of Joseph Wells, riding over a ridge at sunrise, with his hands open and not a single question. And it had led her here, to this porch, to this life, to everything she had not known she was still allowed to want. The stars burned on overhead, indifferent and magnificent, and the wind moved through the grass on both sides of the fence, the stolen acres and the free ones, all of it hers now, all of it home. And in the morning they would ride out together to check the cattle, and Thomas Joseph would come along because he always insisted, bouncing in the saddle with the wild enthusiasm of a small boy on a horse, and they would look at the land in the early light, the red clay and the green grass and the sky going gold above the eastern horizon, and it would be ordinary and extraordinary both at once, the way all true things are, and Florence would think, as she thought every morning, how strange and how right it was that this had been where grief had been trying to lead her all along, not away from loss but through it, not away from love but toward it, home.